T.S. Eliot said, "The endless cycle of idea and action, endless invention, endless experiment, brings knowledge of motion, but not of stillness, knowledge of speech, but not of silence, knowledge of words and ignorance of the word. All our knowledge brings us nearer to our ignorance. All our ignorance brings us near to death. But nearness to death, no nearer to God. Where is the life we've lost in living? Where is the wisdom we've lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we've lost in information? The cycles of heaven in 20 centuries bring us further from God and nearer to the dust." Seems to be tragically true that we can't seem to get beyond the problems that plague humanity. They seem to be getting worse. Actually, look at statistics. The number of people seeking medical treatment for depression in the last 10 years has doubled. Now, that's medical treatment. Most people don't necessarily go to a doctor. In fact, most people don't seek any kind of treatment at all for depression. Less than 50% will seek any kind of help at all. I had all of our staff, and I'll let you judge whether you want to read it or not, but I had all of our staff bought it for me, actually, and read Prozac Backlash. It's written by a man who is a psychiatrist in Boston who teaches part-time at the Harvard Medical School. And that is a sobering book. And I just have clipped an article out of the paper a couple months ago that the number of pharmaceutical representatives in this last 5 years has doubled from 35,000 to over 65,000. I asked my doctor about that, and she said, "I get 10 invitations a week to go to lunch by a pharmaceutical representative. I get 2 invitations a week to take my kids to the zoo or to the theater or something." I said, "You got to be kidding me." And now, am I anti-medicine? No, I'm not. And what we try to do is to look at our book. By the way, this is Finding Hope Again, of which there is a video series we made available for churches. It's an 8-week series. It's got a syllabus. That's what I'm using right now. And our youth edition just came out, Stomping Out Depression. Not a small issue. Amongst adults, depression-induced suicides is the 9th leading cause for death. Amongst teenagers, is 3rd. And so we're losing a lot of kids to something that I think is quite resolvable. Well, in our book, first of all, we look at what we call the agony of the body, and to look at the whole symptoms, essentially, of how prevalent depression is. We are literally in a blues epidemic, and it's a global phenomenon. When I was in Geneva, Switzerland, about 2 years ago, they said, whatever numbers you have for America, you can double them for France. Outside of London, a study was conducted. They said that 70% of our ladies will have at least one clinical episode of depression before they're 65, 40% of our men. So the ladies always ask, how come our ladies are more depressed? It has something to do with who you're living with. Let me quickly say, because we look a lot at brain chemistry on this whole issue and differentiating between bipolar and unipolar type depression. There's a fascinating lady right now. She's hitting the circuit. You probably see her sometime. Named Kay Jameson, and written a fascinating book called Touched with Fire. She herself is bipolar, which is more commonly called that now as opposed to manic depression. And she makes an interesting correlation between madness and creativity. And it's true. She said, during my manic stages, I would be up 23 hours a day and would just produce incredible things. And then, of course, when I went into my hole, I couldn't do anything. But listen to just a small sampling of people who struggled with this. Hans Christian Andersen, John Bunyan, Samuel Clemens, Ralph Waldo Emerson, William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, Herman Melville, Robert Louis Stevenson, Tennessee Williams, Virginia Woolf, composers George Frederick Handel, Robert Schumann, Peter Tchaikovsky, Irving Berlin, Noel Coward, Stephen Foster, Cole Porter, artists Vincent van Gogh, and Michelangelo. 7 of those have been hospitalized for this, and 3 of them have committed suicide. And Leo Tolstoy, the famous Russian philosopher, Christian, he said, the thought of suicide came to me as naturally then as the thought of improving life had come to me before. This thought was such a temptation that I had to use cunning against myself in order not to go through with it too hastily. I did not want to be in a hurry only because I wanted to use all my strength to untangle my thoughts. If I could not get them untangled, I told myself, I could always go ahead with it. And there I was, a fortunate man, carrying a rope from my room, where I was alone every night as I undressed so that I would not hang myself on the beam between the closets. And I quit going hunting with a gun so that I would not be too easily tempted to rid myself of life. I myself did not know what I wanted. I was afraid of life. I struggled to get rid of it, and yet I hoped for something from it. And this was happening to me at a time when, from all indications, I should have been considered a completely happy man. This was when I was not yet 50 years old. I had a good, loving, and beloved wife, fine children, a large estate that was growing and expanding without any effort on my part. More than ever before, I was respected by friends and acquaintances, praised by strangers. I could claim a certain renown without really deluding myself. I share that only for one purpose, because most depression is often related to environmental factors, but this is not obviously the case. So something internally is going on in this man's life. Well, in trying to get through this whole maze, because we're talking now about 18 million Americans have been prescribed Prozac alone, and that's just one of the many SSRIs that are on Zoloft, Paxil, and others, of course, that are on the market today. And I talked to a group of doctors about 2 years ago, and I said, not trying to be critical at all, but I said, my observation is that people go in and express their problems to their doctors, and they correctly diagnose depression. You're in an HMO, you got 10 minutes, what are you going to do? I'm going to write out a prescription. I'm not sure I would either, to be honest with you. If that's all I could do to help these people, I mean, is there temporary relief? Do antidepressants work? Yeah, by and large, they do. Prozac Backlash was fascinating to me because he answered one of my biggest questions. He said, because we've helped people work through their issues, find their freedom, etc., and now they're on this medication. Can I go off of it? Well, I'm not a doctor. I don't step into that place. So I said, talk to your doctor. See if he will let you sequentially work off that. And I've had some go off and, oh man, all the symptoms came back. And he said, that's probably not true. He said, it wasn't the precipitating symptoms. She's experiencing withdrawal from the medication. And what happens is they go off and the symptoms, what they think of the symptoms, come back, and that reinforces the need to get back on the medication again. Now, that's kind of sad, folks. I mean, it's especially in trying to ascertain what is causing all this. Are we actually getting at the causation of depression? Well, I tried to draw an analogy of our own anatomy here, that your brain is, in this computer operation, is like the hardware, and your mind is the software. And we're pretty well led to believe that if you're struggling with depression, it's got to be a hardware problem. And I don't think so. In fact, hardly anybody does. If you really dig into the research on this, especially, nor does that explain the incredible growth of this so-called common cold of mental illnesses. Why have we had a tenfold increase in depression? Is it because our body chemistry has changed that much? Well, your software seems to be where Scripture is directed at. Can you have a hardware problem? Well, first of all, yes, of course you can. Alzheimer's disease, organic brain syndrome, bullet between the ears, hardware problem. Actually, let me give a quote out of Time magazine. Despite years of study and impressive breakthroughs, researchers are only beginning to understand the chemical's complex role in the functioning of the body and brain, and how doctors can make adjustments when serotonin levels go out of balance. So far, the tools used to manipulate serotonin in the human brain are more like pharmacological machetes than they are like scalpels. Crudely effective, but capable of doing plenty of collateral damage, says Barry Jacobs, a neuroscientist at Princeton University. We just don't know enough about how the brain works. Well, one of the things that they're discovering, the whole idea of SSRI, serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors, is that it's selective. That the only thing that's being affected by this medication is serotonin. Well, that's not true, actually. By the way, for what it's worth, only 5% of the serotonin in your system right now is in your brain. It's a body issue. And it's only one of about 30 or more neurotransmitters, but the one most related apparently to moods. But they've already established the fact that if you increase the serotonin level, you're going to decrease the dopamine. The point of it is that the brain will adapt, will adjust to it. So you start manipulating that body chemistry, it's an interesting issue. And I think they're right. There is no precise way to measure brain chemistry. That may surprise a lot of people, but if you went in and see a psychiatrist, they'd be the first to say it's true. I have no way to monitor that. I can't determine the outflow of serotonin in your brain cells. He said, so what am I doing? I'm looking at the symptoms, and based on experience and what research has shown you, I'm going to prescribe this kind of medication. That's what they're doing. And then they'll come back and adjust how to work. Well, maybe let's switch to this or increase the dosage or whatever. Now, like I said earlier, I said, the truth of the matter is you can kind of jumpstart a battery sometimes that way, but if you are really a good, holistic person, you'd want to look more than a dead battery. What's causing it? Let me see if I can explain a little bit how I perceive what's going on. Let's look at the problem of stress. Your body adapts to certain degrees of pressures and stress in your life, primarily through your adrenal glands. When stress persists, your adrenal glands will secrete a cortisol-like hormone into your blood system. And that's where we get our fight and our flight kind of response to pressures of life. If stress persists too long, stress becomes distress, your system breaks down, you can't keep up with it. And you have future shock, rapid rate of change, and your body can't adapt, and chances are you're going to get sick. But now why is it that some people can respond to stress and actually flourish? Is it because they have superior adrenal glands? No, I don't think that's the issue, see. Can they be different? Can somebody have a greater capacity physically to deal with certain physical pressure? Sure, there's some differences there. But I don't think that's the major difference. I think the major difference is really right in here and how you perceive that. When the Philistines were challenging the Israelites, and they said, well let's not have a bloodbath here. Let's just have our champions duke it out. And the problem is they had a giant and you didn't. And here's all the Israelites. They're all stressed out, man. They're scared stiff, actually. Along comes David and says, how dare you taunt the armies of the living God, and pulls out his slingshot and slays the giant. Now, can faith have that kind of an effect on us? And the answer is yes, it can. See, David saw the giant in relationship to God when the Israelites saw it in relationship to themselves. And so, yeah, faith can have that kind of an effect on us if we understood it properly. But my point in saying this is that your body would naturally adapt to the stress environment around you. I mean, it's a God-given thing. But where did this signal originate from? From my adrenal glands? No. That's part of your autonomic nervous system. So somehow a signal came from my brain. Did my brain determine that? No, my brain picked up the external environment through my 5 senses. So they looked over, they saw the Israelites. So that signal was sent to the brain. Now the brain can't function any other way than how it's been programmed. So what determined the signal that was sent to the adrenal glands really wasn't the brain, it was the mind. Now, how are you transformed? By the renewing of your mind. Now, let me just draw a rough parallel here for a second. Suppose on your computer at home, you put in a new program, new software, okay? And when you loaded that into your computer, took the disk back out, did the weight of the computer change? No. Did the components of the computer change? No. Did the output change? Sure, you can see it on the screen. Did the flow of electrons change? Yes, that's the signal carriers, essentially. Now, here you are, you're a new believer, you have the mind of Christ, and somehow you're in the process of being transformed by the renewing of your mind. When you received Christ, did your weight change? Did the number of neurons change? Did the number of neurotransmitters change? No, they were all in place. Did the flow of them change? Sure it did. Of course it did. You see what I'm getting at here, folks? Just look at one illustration of this. You can walk by the Spirit. What's the evidence of that? Love, joy, peace, patience. Now, did anything change in your physical anatomy? Did the outcome change? Oh, sure. What's coming out? You could see it on your face, your muscles tightened or didn't tighten, whatever. But what was the result of that? It was just simply that you chose to walk at that moment by the Spirit and filled with God's Holy Spirit, sake melody and hearts to the Lord. The point I'm really trying to make is that trying to just manipulate the neurotransmitters, when it seems to me that you're transformed by the renewing of your mind, that what you ought to do is to somehow get people to establish a faith basis for what they're living for, interpreting these events of life through the grid of Scripture. And hopefully you won't fall apart every time trials and tribulations come your way, and there's a faith that is there. Well, now the question is, and see, this is a huge question, and frankly, it's a big issue among psychiatrists. Which came first? Did I have a neurological problem that led to a depression, or did I have a sense of helplessness and hopelessness that created actually a neurological problem? Where do you think most of the evidence is leaning to right now? It's the latter. That you have a learned state of helplessness and hopelessness, which in many cases is what depression is. And they've actually experimented with this in lab dogs and animals and all kinds of things. And they can bring about a whole morbid state by creating in their belief that they're helpless and they're hopeless to do anything about it. And I've seen that. I was over in Croatia about 7 years ago, right in the middle of the war. We were in a refugee center. I was training about 50 pastors at the time, and everyone came was depressed. Every one of them. I mean, try singing. Oh my gosh. I mean, you just look at their face. I mean, you can see depression by and large in just the countenance of their face. Psalm 42, Psalm 43, 3 times the same verse says, "Why are you in despair, O my soul? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him in the help of my countenance." Well, the good news was that we left there. I don't think there was one man depressed. And really wasn't talking about depression, actually. I was talking about who they were in Christ. See, under communism has stripped them of any sense of self. They were in a minority in every way. They weren't communists and they weren't Catholics. And in Croatia, what's left? You and the few dogs and cats. And they had, what communism did was so devastating. It stripped them of any sense of self. It's like there is no self. It's all state. And in the hardcore belief over there, I said any self can be sacrificed for the state. Wouldn't even be considered hardly lost because the state has to be preserved. And you live in that kind of an environment, you have what you call a learned sense of helplessness. And somehow you have to overcome that. And that's a critical part of our book, is overcoming helplessness and hopelessness. Well, here's Martin Seligman. He's one of these researchers and secular guy. He said, "I spent the last 20 years trying to learn what causes depression. Here's what I think. Bipolar depression, manic depression, is an illness of the body, biological in origin, and containable by drugs." Now, I'd be half in agreement with him there. We've seen a lot of people come to us who've been diagnosed that. Now, bipolar depression is not typically considered a neurotransmitter problem. It's usually related to the brain cell itself, and there's a sodium ion compound there that when they discovered lithium, there's trace elements of it in drinking water down in Texas someplace, and there was no manic depressive. So that's how they actually discovered that. And so I would say, by and large, if there's any kind of depression that is most likely to be benefited or helped by medication, it would be bipolar. But yet I wouldn't carte blanche say that that's the only need that they have. And actually, Kay Jameson went. Kay Jameson said medication helped me endure, but if it wasn't for the support of the community getting me through those times, I wouldn't have made it. And so some unipolar depressions, too, are partly biological, particularly the fiercest ones. But inherited unipolar depressions are in the minority. This raises the question of where the great number of depressions making up the epidemic in this country come from. I ask myself if human beings have undergone physical changes over the century that have made them more vulnerable to depression. Probably not. It's very doubtful that our brain chemistry or our genes have changed radically over the last 2 generations. So a tenfold increase in depression is not likely to be explained on biological grounds. I suspect that the epidemic depression so familiar to all of us is best viewed as psychological. Very secular man here, okay? My guess is that most depression starts with problems in living and with specific ways of thinking about these problems. Bingo. Now, if you talk to cognitive therapists, they have what they call a depression triad, that people are depressed because of a negative view of themselves, of their circumstances, and of the future. And if you just want to jot down 2 Corinthians chapters 2 through 4, go home and do your own little study and see how God would answer that. I agree with that, by the way. I think the analysis is right. The answer is not sufficient enough for me. But helping people work through the fact that circumstances are not determining who they are, and there is always a sense of hope for every believer, and that hope really essentially lies in God. Now, if I, as in talking to believers, wanted to take away your hope, all I would have to do is to distort your concept of God and somehow distort your concept of yourself. or to question your salvation, because there we go your hope. Let me illustrate that. Psalm 7:13, Psalm 13, something like that. Anyway, David said, "How long, O Lord, wilt thou forget me forever? How long will I take counsel in my soul all day long? How long will my enemies be exalted over me?" I was a depressed man. Why? Because of circumstances? Actually, I don't think so. Listen to the first verse. "How long, O Lord, wilt thou forget me forever?" Now, if you had an adequate understanding of God, can an omniscient God forget you for a moment, much less forever? Well, that's what he thought. Now, if you think that, guess what happens? Down you go. Because your emotions are essentially a product of your thought life anyhow. Lamentations chapter 3. I'm sure you're all familiar with that one, where poor old Jeremiah, he's convinced God's out to get him. You know, he feels entrapped and endangered and whatever else, and he said, "I've lost my hope. This I recall to my mind." I mean, just the next verse. "This I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. His mercies are renewed every morning, great is thy faithfulness." What changed in the circumstances? Nothing. It's all right here, wasn't it? Right here. And that essentially is, I believe, where the battle is coming from. Now, we're going way too fast for all this, but in the book we deal with hopelessness and helplessness, but I want to actually get to what I believe is the number one cause for depression. And that's a reaction to losses in our lives. I'll tell you why I think this is so critical, why I think every church has to come to terms with this. Because everything you have right now, someday you shall lose. Everything. We're not talking about depression. We're talking about life. This is something that I think has to be taught to our churches so well. And without putting a guilt trip on it, you must be in sin. That's why you're depressed. Well, now I'm really depressed. Thank you very much. And superficial answers like that just causes people to go underground. And primarily because we don't know how to respond to people who have any kind of mental or emotional problems. Physical problems? Wow, we're great at that, folks. Broke your leg? Hey, I'll come by, sign your cast. Can I bring you a meal? And, how you doing? And go out of your way. And somebody slips off for about 2 weeks in a mental hospital and they come back. What do you say? How's your head, by the way? I mean, you know what I'm saying? We don't know how to respond to them. And you kind of tiptoe around them and they feel it and they can sense it too. Are you aware of this? It is. It's not a small problem, folks. I mean, I'm telling you a statistic that says that probably right now 10% of the people in your church are bordering on the clinical depression. 10%. So we're not dealing with a lot of pastors. And even more pastors' wives. Because they're depressed living with that guy. Anyway, it's now, number one problem is actually a reaction to losses in our lives. And this is no small thing. I got to tell you about a boy. This boy was kind of chubby. He was 5 or 6 years old. He used to ask his mom, I'm going to make it through school. And for the next 6 years, every time fall semester would start, he had all these insecurities. And it was about a 6th and 7th grade teacher that he had that really turned him around and got him to believe a little more in himself, etc. By the time he reached high school, he was senior class president, captain of the football team, had his own swing band, and graduated valedictorian. Went on to the University of Minnesota, full ride scholarship, got bored by it, went out to Stanford. Came back and worked for Minnesota Mining in the summertime and owned 2 patents by the time he was 20. Took a year off between his junior and senior year and went over to Germany, learned German, coached a football team, concocted a canoe trip, and came back and as soon as the weather broke and canoed to the Hudson Bay from Lake Superior. Eric Severide was the only other guy to do it and wrote a book about it called Distant Fires. Went back to Stanford and finished top of his class with a double major in mechanical engineering and history. Built a submarine as a senior project. Went over Lake Tahoe, took it down 100 feet. It's on display at the Maritime Museum in San Francisco. Went to work for Bechtel, got bored with it, and wanted to fly F-16s and made life miserable for the poor Air National Guard guy in Duluth, and finally got him in and graduated top of that. And wanted him to turn around and come back immediately and be a pilot, test pilot. And they wanted to stay in Duluth because he went to work for Cirrus as their test pilot and made aviation history by taking a little plane up to 20,000 feet and pulling the chute, installing it, and landing it safely. And wrote a book about that, by the way, called Distant Fires. Lone Rider, I guess it was. I just finished videotaping our conference, this last one we have down here, and was taking a little time off in Arizona. I got a call that Scott had gone down. What a loss. Left behind a wife pregnant with her first child. Never seen my brother cry until then. Paul was a graduate of University of Minnesota Med School and was taught at the med school at Duluth, and was nearing retirement at the time. And you just have to scratch your head. The hard part for me was that Paul used to say Scott's so much like he was scary, and we even looked alike. Every time we get together, it was a fun little contest. Frankly, I don't think I ever could accomplish in my lifetime what he was potentially capable of. And part of my loss, to be honest with you, I wanted to see what he did with the rest of his 33 years. Fascinating guy. I could hardly talk about that for a year. And my conversation and relationship with my brother changed dramatically after that. Where we'd cordially talk for 2 minutes before, it was more like a half an hour, and on really meaningful things, not just family chit-chat. And there is no such thing as permanence. And I think we have a responsibility to prepare our people for impermanence. Actually, Jesus did, and with the disciples. 3 times in the Gospel of Mark, he told them, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, be crucified, dead, and buried. And first time it was met with Peter's great denial. Oh, no, it may not be you. Get behind me, Satan. And second time, they didn't want to talk about it. Third time, they were afraid. And point of it is that that's something I think in terms of our Christian experience and walk, we all have to prepare ourselves for. That there are going to be losses in our life. You're going to experience crises. And you can put loss right beside it. It's the same issue, by and large. And it can be threatened, imagined, or real, for that matter. And the initial response to it is very predictable, and this isn't mine. Actually, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with the sequence that naturally follows that. And the first is denial, which can last 30 seconds or 30 years. But the idea essentially, oh, no, not me. It's all a bad dream. But let's say you get through that pretty fast, and then there's a sense of anger. Why me? How come? And, I saw my brother go through this. It was, at the funeral, it was just unbelievable. In fact, I had not yet published Freedom from Fear, and I had a chance to dedicate it to my nephew. And inside is a little caption that life is the pursuit, not the capture. And here was a guy that seemed to have overcome every blooming fear they ever had. I've never seen a guy so unrestricted in that regard. He was one free spirit. And I almost came out of my boots when I saw the cover, which I hadn't seen. It came out, and here's a guy out in the lake in a canoe. And the canoe was kind of his symbol almost in a way. But my brother, what in the world happened? Now he lived on the edge, that was part of his life. And he'd seen 3 others go down in F-16s, and so that wasn't total shock in that regard, I suppose. But and Paul says, people say God's will, that kind of ticks people off, and I said, I don't know what God's will for his life is. I know God's will for my life is my sanctification. I said, it's not so much what I do or how long I stay here. It's really more who I am. And I said, I don't have an answer for you, Paul, other than God gave up his only son when he was 33. And I said, I don't know. I said, I can tell you this. Heaven's a little different right now. Our useful purpose for creation doesn't end at our physical death, folks. There's another eternity ahead of us. We don't know what it is. We honestly don't. I have a theory, probably wrong, there's no basis for it biblically that I know of, but I honestly believe that we are created for a purpose. And then when our purpose for serving God is better fulfilled on the other side than here, that's our time. And I don't understand that, I just have to trust God. Precious in the sight is the death of one of his godly ones. See, that requires us to get out of a time orientation into an eternal one. From a time orientation, that really doesn't make sense at all, does it? He's gone. Well, where is he? He's with the Lord. So from an eternal perspective, no more pain. Obviously your heart goes out to his wife. And when his first child finally came into the world, it was a boy. Do you name him Scott? How in the world would you like to follow Scott? Well, she did. She chose Scott. And chose to call him by his middle name. And respect to Dad. But, just being with Paul, what he needed is somebody just to listen to him and cry with him. And I tried to give him some pat answers and something he just had to work through. And he's still working through it. I asked how his brother and sister are doing. He said, but they don't talk about it. And, it's one of those tough issues of life. And experienced something like that in their family before. But then they bargain a little bit. Well, maybe I can alter this. Maybe I can change the circumstances. Maybe I can recover my losses here, whatever else. Well, that don't work, so you get depressed. Does a Christian go through that? Yes, we do, folks. Can we minimize the downtime? Yes, I think we can. And why is it, however, that some people bounce back from these things faster than other people? We all experience losses. It's a necessary part of life. See, a crisis that happens in our life doesn't destroy us. It does reveal who we are, however. Painfully at times. The loss is permanent, but it doesn't have to permanently affect us. And actually, I'll go so far as to say is that God never sees our trouble as a permanent issue. Listen to the verse. 2 Corinthians 4:17. He said, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. But when you hit the bottom of the curve, that's the defining moment at that time. You're either going to resign and drop out and walk away from God, church, whatever else it is that you lost at that time, or you get to a point of acceptance. That's the critical defining moment at that time, that it's a loss, I can't do anything about it, but I've got to get on with my life. I've got the rest of my life ahead of me, and I can't change what happened, but by the grace of God, I can change myself. And I think I can come out of this crisis a better person than I went into it. And I think that's where your hope lies. Romans chapter 5, verse 3 says, we exalt in our tribulation, though that tribulation brings perseverance, proven hope, proven character, hope, and a hope that doesn't disappoint, because the love of God has been poured forth out into our hearts. I was riding an airplane one time, and those magazines they have in there, and they have these little pictures or signs that they, to promote excellence and all that kind of stuff. And one really caught my attention. It was this windy road, and it says, the bend in the road is not the end of the road unless you fail to make the turn. And this was a bend in the road experience for my brother. I mean, a dramatic one for me in a lot of ways, actually. Probably the closest family member I've ever lost. And it meant a lot to me. But it's a bend in the road. Life is different. It's going to be without Scott. And you start making plans in that direction. Now, why is it, however, that some people can make that turn in life and come out of it and go on and do? I said, you never, in one sense, ever quite get over that. I mean, it has an effect on your life that is probably permanent in that regard, but it doesn't have to permanently negatively affect you. And there are three mental constructs that pretty much define how fast you will get out of that kind of a rut. One of them is permanence. If you have the sense that this is going to have a negative effect on me that's going to last forever, your chances of coming back are very poor. The speed of recovery is greatly affected by whether we think the consequences of this crisis are short-term or long-term. Now, that's kind of a humorous way to look at it, but suppose a husband thinks one morning his wife is cranky and she's in a bad mood. Well, the long-term problem or short-term? See, if he views it as a short-term, it'll just kind of blow over. I'll just go to work and come home tonight and be a different woman there. But now, And his decision may I'll avoid confrontation right now and wait for that time of the month to pass. But but if he concludes that my wife is just simply a cranky person and she's just very irritable, that's a long-term problem. Now listen to the cycle he can go through. I'm going to ignore her. That's denial. I'm going to try controlling her. That's anger. I'm going to try to appease her. That's bargaining. I'm going to try to change her. That's depressing. I'm going to avoid her. That's resignation. I'm going to love her and learn to live with her. That's acceptance. See, that's a growing crisis that we go through. Not changing her, changing myself. Johnny Erickson Tada said, I wanted to die and end my life. The frustration I felt at not being able to do that only intensified my depression. I was so desperate, I begged one of my friends to help me end it all. Aren't you glad she didn't? I mean, think what a blessing that she has been. Who knows? She may have been a great horseman or athlete or something like that. Probably never had the ministry she has today. Talk about somebody, taking a crisis and getting all the good out of it. Boy, that's the best example I know. Pervasiveness. The idea is, it will ruin my whole life. Well, there's a time to mourn. It's all over. It's pervasive. I'm finished. It's done. But if you experience loss in one area, folks, you're not a loser. If you fail to accomplish one goal, you're not a failure. And people have a tendency to think that way, however, and the chances are then the loss is going to continue to have a negative effect on you. And the great statement, he is no fool to give up that which he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. I mean, think of Paul for a moment. Boy, leading candidate for Theologian of the Year, the respect of the community, and one day he lost it all. Didn't he? All of it. He lost his place in his society, the Jewish society. He lost his position. He lost everything, folks. He really honestly did. And actually, I think that's probably why he went away for a period of time. It wasn't just necessary to learn. I think there was some sense of grief there that everything I studied for under Gamaliel is now all gone. But when he came back, what was he able to say about it? I count everything but loss, apart from the surpassing value of gaining Christ Jesus my Lord. You know what I've observed, which ties into this whole idea, is that a prolonged depression oftentimes signals an over-attachment to people, places, and things that eventually we're all going to lose anyhow. And I say over-attachment. It's not that we don't become attached to our family and our friends and that kind of thing, but an over-attachment. And without realizing the fact that even though we think life will go on just like it always is, it never does. Now, I got plans for the next year and a half, provided I'm alive. And you have to listen to what James says. Hey, tomorrow we'll do thus and thus. You fool, don't be foolish. Your life is like a vapor, here today, gone tomorrow. And so if the Lord wills, so that's almost in my mind to begin with. Well, Lord willing, I'll be there, But I have no idea, whether I'll make it out of the snowstorm or not. And lastly, personalization. It's me, it's all my fault. And people get in that rut. There's two extremes here. One is to assume no sense of responsibility for what happened. That's no good. But the other sense is to assume an over-responsibility that was never meant for you to have. You're not the whole problem of this world. You can get out of it. Now, getting out of that rut, which is where you're at, reminds me of a story, by the way. This old pasture had a big rain. A truck went through and just put some deep grooves in the road. And a frog came along and hopped in the rut and got stuck in the rut. And couldn't get out. And his friends came along one day and said, why don't you get out of there? He said, no, I'm stuck in the rut. Came back the next day, still there. And the following day, he was bouncing around the old pasture. And what happened? A Mack truck came along and had to get out of there. And sometimes it takes that. It takes a good friend to come along and say to you, it's time to move on. You can sit here and feel sorry for yourself if you want to, but you're not experiencing anything anybody else hasn't. And I had a little loss myself this summer, Been athletic all my life, and suddenly 2 surgeries, one in June and one on August 6th. Had both my knees replaced. And they finally found a match, by the way. It was an orangutan in Zimbabwe. My wife was looking forward to it. She said, I can wheel you around anywhere I want to go. And I'm going to stand off for 20 feet and make you beg for your medicine. Give you a lot of time to think. That's well, here's the thinking. See, it's all my fault. See, that the company didn't get that contract. That's personalization. Now I'm never going to get the promotion I want. That's permanence. See, I'm a total failure in life. That's pervasiveness. The constructs of personalization, permanence, and pervasiveness dominate the way depressed people think. If you experience loss in one area, don't generalize it into a total life crisis. Keep it specific. If you experience a crisis today, don't allow it to affect you tomorrow. Keep sharp accounts. If the world is disintegrating around you, don't accept the blame when it's not appropriate. If you're suffering the consequences of a bad decision, change what you can, minimize your losses, and move on. Well, running out of time. Part of it is changing your beliefs from I'm the problem to it's a problem. That's no small thing, folks. Somebody comes up and says, I got a problem child. What would you say? No, you don't. You have a child that has a problem. See, what's the difference? Well, if you got a problem child, the only way to get rid of the problem is... But if your child has a problem, maybe we can get rid of that. That's no small thing, actually. It's in everything, in this one thing, is how you ought to be thinking. And forever, no, for a season. All of life, in one sense, is for a season. And this too will pass. It'll pass. Well, some of these losses can be not just threatened, but imagined. And a lot of these losses are not always concrete. Some of them are very abstract. Suppose you accept a call to another church, and it's quite a promotion. In fact, salary increase. You're going to live in a better community. And so you accept the position, and you move there, and for the next 3 months, you can't understand why in the world your wife is depressed. Gee, look at the nice house we got. We got more money now to send our kids to school. What'd she lose, folks? Friends, family, connections, ministry even. All kinds of important things in our life that are lost in those kind of moves. And sometimes they're not overlooked, and they're harder to deal with when you don't know exactly what it is that you're grieving. I've only actually grieved once in my life for loss, and it was really a strange experience. It was my last year I taught at Talbot. I knew God was calling me out of there. I had 3 degrees from Talbot. My kids went to Biola. You get entrenched. They even liked me there. And what was the hardest part for me is my colleagues that I'd pulled together in our department were more than colleagues. We were friends. You don't always have that in ministry. You know what I mean? That we all liked each other. We met once a week for prayer, and I put it together. I just walked away from that. Never looked back. I mean, I grieved that year, but when I left, I never looked back. It was an interesting experience for me, but I personally never grieved a loss like that. Well, working through that process, but coming out the other side, there's a new sense. Really, I put identity in there. I think that's part of it. Before I was Mr. or Mrs. or some title, a pastor or whatever else, some of that lost there. But the intention of coming out of that, I think, by God, is to deepen our realization of the eternal relationship that we have with God. I know who I am, folks. I'm a child of God. Had I not known that, I'm not so sure how to survive some of the issues in my life. I was depressed once. It was the worst 45 minutes of my life. But my wife was depressed so severely. For 15 months, I didn't know whether she was going to live or die. And we lost everything we had. We tell our story in the book, if you want to read it. It's I don't say that to garner any sympathy from you whatsoever. Truth of the matter is the birth of Freedom Christ Ministries. God just brought me to the end of my resources so I could discover God's. I had a lot of them, folks. I had 5 earned degrees. And people liked me. School was going well. But I look back at that and realize that, I wouldn't be here today without that experience. I wouldn't be here. I don't think there's anybody in this room knows any better than I do. I don't set a captive free. I don't bind up the brokenhearted. Only God can do that. But I had to get to that point where God, gave me something I could not fix. I was Mr. Fix-It, too. Oh, Dad'll fix it. Couldn't fix it. No matter how I prayed, no matter what I said, no matter what I did, nothing changed. 15 months, lost everything we had. And God stripped us down, and all we had was God and each other. For the first time, is God all you need? That was actually the birth of Freedom in Christ Ministries. That was the beginning. And every book I've written was all after that. Every tape I've recorded, all after that. So it was a crisis that we family had to go through. If I had looked through that door 20 years ago and saw what my family would have to go through to be here, I probably wouldn't have come. I mean, I'm not a martyr, folks. Looking back, glad I came. Well, deeper relationships, meaningful, deeper scenario for that matter, growth in character, and a new lifestyle. I think that's the intention. I like what Buzz Aldrin, the astronaut, said. My depression forced me at the age of 41 to stop and for the first time examine my life. And sometimes God just takes us off course and puts us in a position where we realize more deeply than we ever have before how dependent upon Him we really are. It usually precipitates the need that we don't see ourselves for a life change and for new relationships and this type of thing. And it's even been shown, by the way, that over 60% of all of those who've lost their jobs, either firing or layoffs or whatever else, move on to something better in life. And whether you move on or not is a lot to do with just you, to bounce back in life and things. But, from my own perspective, looking back, had I not known at that time, had not God taken me through some experiences to really reveal to me who I was. Because if you know who you are in Christ, you can stand alone if you have to. And because your security is not in any human position or possession. It's really in your relationship with God. It's an eternal one, not a temporal one. And God had already established that first in my life. And to prepare me for some of the junk that you go through in life, which we all go through. I'm not no different than you. Probably a bigger target than some of you, but that's about it. Running out of time, looking at suffering, that's a part of it. And in our book, we discuss our period of what I call walking through the darkness, which I think is really a ministry of trust in our lives, that God allows us to go through an experience like that and learn a lot about myself. There were some things in my heart that I didn't like, that God showed me. What was left of my self-sufficient, stoic, Norwegian farm background that would raise his head in ministry and say, why don't you do some push-ups and read your Bible more, mercifully got stripped out, those kind of issues. But, I can stand before you and say, boy, as tough as that was, I thank God for it. And I think my wife would stand here beside me and say, that's true. Interesting experience in our own life like that, but we are what we are by the grace of God. If I have any haunting resurrections of those thoughts, it's like, why are we so darn stubborn? And you wouldn't have taken that much to get you to where God wanted you to be. There's probably some truth to that. But anyway, if there was, I wouldn't tell you.